Chapter 24. Laying a Trap. The laptop and backup drives had told me all they could, so handing them in to the police wasn't an issue. Saturday morning, I rode my bicycle to the station, and thankfully Pesky wasn't on duty, so I didn't have to listen to his lectures on interfering with police business. I explained to the desk clerk what had happened, and filled out numerous forms stating that Cat had found the computer, and I was turning it in. Scrawling my signature on the bottom, I handed the forms in and was assured that Officer Pesky would follow up with me. Drat! I had rather hoped he wouldn't. I gave a tight smile to the desk clerk and left the police station. Unfortunately, it was Saturday. This meant that Casing's insurance was closed. However, I knew that on Saturday mornings Mrs. Casings could be found at the local garden club, as could Tammy Farley, who was just as much a gossip as her friend Maisie. Between the three of them, I fully believed Tammy would tell Maisie everything she might overhear. The entire town would know anything within the hour. They were that good at spreading news. So I went to the grocery store and picked out the saddest, droopiest, cheapest clearance plant I could find before bringing it to the library. Every second Saturday of the month, the Green Thumb Gardening Club held a meeting in the basement, promptly at 10 o'clock. Smiling at the librarian Marcy, I went down the stairs and directly to the meeting room, where I could hear Mrs. Casings droning on about the merits of good fertilizer. Grabbing a complimentary coffee from the table set up to the side, I took a seat in the back, setting my sad plant beside me. Mrs. Casings looked at me a little askance, but continued with her boring presentation. I was late, and I had never been to one of the meetings before, which was why many of the ladies and gentlemen in the room turned to give me at least a cursory glance before returning their attention to Mrs. Casings. Tammy whispered something to the woman beside her, and I bet it wasn't a particularly complimentary remark about me. That was okay. I was here to get attention. It was all part of the plan. I pasted a pleasant smile on my face and stared directly at the presentation, ignoring any curious looks. It took another half-hour before Mrs. Casings wrapped up the lecture on nitrogen versus ammonia. There was a spattering of polite applause, which I made certain to join in just a little too enthusiastically. Getting up from my seat, I snagged the clearance plant, bringing it with me as I approached my part-time boss. Mrs. Casings, what an informative and interesting lecture! I have never thought about fertilizer being so compelling before. Mrs. Casings blinked at me in surprise. "Vi, how lovely to see you. I wasn't aware you were a member. I've never seen you at the Green Thumb Club before." "I'm thinking of joining." I lean in a little, lowering my voice. My house is a little drab these days, and I thought I should spice up the flower beds. It's important to beautify the town. I heard you were in the club, and I just knew you might have some recommendations about what I should do. "Oh, yes." Mrs. Casing's eyes gleamed as she began to expound on different plants which might grow well in my yard with the sunlight and soil. I know Mrs. Casing loves gardening and plants. The front window of the insurance building is a veritable jungle of potted greenery. It doesn't take much to get her to chat about her favorite subject, and I nod in all the right places with murmurs of agreement. "What on earth is wrong with that plant?" interrupts Tammy with a disgusted voice. "This one?" I feigned surprise, holding up my potted friend. "I really don't know. That's why I brought it to the meeting. I thought Mrs. Casings would be able to tell me, since she's such an avid gardener." Mrs. Casings is pleased with my compliment in front of all her gardening friends. She positively preens with importance as she takes the plant from me to examine. "It's yellow. The soil is too moist. You have overwatered it," tutted Mrs. Casings. "How terrible!" I pretend some dismay at her remarks. "How often should I water it?" This receives some debate from different members of the group who have been eavesdropping on the whole exchange, and I get conflicting information until finally Mrs. Casings declares once a week should suffice. I thank her and fake a gasp as I look at my watch. Oh dear, I'd better get going. I can't be late for the cemetery tour. "That's hours from now," frowned Mrs. Casings. "Surely you don't have to leave just yet." Usually we go for lunch. I thought you might join us." "I wish I could," I said regretfully. "Will you be coming to the cemetery tour?" "That old thing?" snorted Tammy. "Why would anyone want to go to a play about dead people is beyond me." "I enjoy going to the cemetery tour," someone, an elderly gentleman, piped up. There are a few murmurs of agreement from the crowd. "I'm so sorry I can't make it to the luncheon." I sighed and gave what I hoped was a sufficiently unhappy look to Mrs. Casings. "I have to get changed, rehearse my lines with Cat one last time, and I still have to meet with Officer Pesky." "Officer Pesky?" questioned Tammy, suddenly looking a lot less bored of my presence. "Yes," I nodded. "He's meeting me at the beginning of the cemetery tour. I'm giving him Carl's laptop." "You found Carl's laptop?" gasped Tammy, grabbing my arm painfully. I decided to tell the truth. Well, an edited version of it. Cat found it. I'm just handing it in to Officer Pesky. I hope it will help find the person who murdered Carl. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. Look for the next chapter right here on YouTube. Happy listening.